Hi, friends. Imagine a king so cursed by his own body that Europe whispered about his bedroom more than his throne. A king whose deformities were so grotesque, so bizarre, that his wedding nights became the stuff of scandal and horror. This is the story of Ferdinand VII of Spain, a monarch remembered not for his military victories or brilliant policies, but for what happened behind locked doors on his wedding night. They called him the Felon King, not because of his crimes against nations, but because of the unnatural sentence his own body had given him. He was deformed in ways that shocked even the cynical courts of 19th century Europe. And his curse wasn't just personal. His failures in the bedroom became a crisis for Spain itself. Before you get comfortable, consider hitting that like button and subscribe if you enjoy these stories. I would also love to hear from you. Where are you listening from and what time it is? It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. On the night of his marriage to a 16-year-old bride, the tension was unbearable. The church expected heirs. The court expected proof of virility. The entire continent waited for news. Instead, they got a disaster so humiliating that it would echo through the palace walls for decades. The girl was so terrified by what she saw, so horrified by the king's body, that she soiled herself, right there, in the royal bed. What followed was 4 marriages, the whispers of popes, and even a custom-built cushion, all in a desperate attempt to produce a single heir. And in the process, Ferdinand VII's private dysfunction shaped the future of Spain and changed the course of European history. This is not a love story. This is a grotesque comedy of errors, where royal duty collided with biology, and the most powerful throne in Europe was nearly toppled by a bedroom farce. So buckle up, because the tale of Ferdinand VII proves one thing. Sometimes, history's most shocking battles aren't fought with armies. They're fought under the sheets. 1. The Felon King's Curse. To understand the madness of Ferdinand VII, you first have to picture him. And fair warning, once you do, you may never be able to unsee it. Ferdinand wasn't born to be a monster, at least not in the fairy tale sense. But somewhere between inbreeding, bad genetics, and sheer cosmic cruelty, the Spanish crown produced a king who looked less like a ruler and more like the villain in a bad cartoon. They called him El Rey Felon, the Felon King. Not because he robbed banks or burned villages, but because he stole Spain's future with his sheer incompetence. Even his face betrayed him, a jaw that seemed to sag, eyes that bulged like he was perpetually surprised, and a body that carried the unmistakable marks of Habsburg inbreeding. You could say he was Spain's most disastrous export since the Armada. But the real horror wasn't what you saw in public. It was what his unfortunate brides discovered in private. Behind the velvet curtains of the royal bedchamber lay a truth so grotesque it became whispered gossip across Europe. Ferdinand's royal equipment was unusable. Not merely small, not merely weak, but twisted, deformed, a cruel joke of nature. Even doctors struggled to describe it politely. One physician compared it to a key that fit no lock. Another, less diplomatic, muttered that the king was an air-making machine built in hell. It was, in short, a medical puzzle that no bride on earth could solve. And here's where history becomes both tragic and hilarious, because in the 19th century, a king's worth wasn't measured by his speeches or his policies. It was measured by his ability to create heirs. Ferdinand, for all his crowns and jewels, couldn't do the one job required of him: pass on the dynasty. This failure would ripple across Europe. But in the moment, it turned every wedding night into a grotesque performance, part farce, part horror show, and entirely unforgettable. Because nothing unites gossip faster than the image of a king fumbling in the dark while a terrified bride prays to faint before it's over. And yet Ferdinand tried. Oh, he tried. And Spain, poor Spain, suffered the consequences. 2. The young bride and the wedding night from hell. royal weddings in 19th century Spain were not just family celebrations, they were political theater. Every gesture, every vow, every whispered rumor could make or break alliances. And so, when Ferdinand VII married his young bride, the kingdom buzzed with expectation. The ceremony was grand. Golden altars gleamed, choirs thundered hymns, and nobles fanned themselves as if history itself were sitting in the pews. Spain needed an heir, and everyone prayed this marriage would deliver one. But when the celebration faded, the palace walls carried a different story. The young bride, barely out of childhood, found herself facing a husband who was not the gallant monarch she had been promised. Ferdinand was heavy, awkward, and carried the air of a man permanently annoyed at his own existence. For a girl raised on tales of noble knights, her first impression of the king was closer to a nightmare than a dream. And then came the infamous wedding night, the moment when Spain expected destiny to be secured. Ministers lingered anxiously in the corridors, servants pressed their ears to doors, and the entire royal household seemed to hold its breath. What happened behind those doors is still debated, but one thing is certain: it did not go well. In fact, it went catastrophically wrong. Instead of triumph, the night ended in chaos and humiliation. The bride, overwhelmed by fear and shock, completely broke down, and an unfortunate accident happened. Attendants rushed in, the chamber fell into disarray, and the entire palace soon buzzed with whispers of a royal disaster. By dawn, those whispers had galloped beyond Madrid. France laughed first. Courtiers smirked, calling Ferdinand the king who could not begin. In Britain, cartoonists sketched mocking caricatures: a bewildered king on one side of the bed, a panicked bride fleeing on the other. In Vienna, nobles clinked glasses and muttered that Spain's dynasty was collapsing not on the battlefield, but in the bedroom. For Ferdinand, it was the humiliation of a lifetime. Kings were measured not only by crowns and treaties, but by their ability to secure heirs. And here was Spain's monarch, failing in the most public way possible. His private struggle had become Europe's favorite joke. The bride suffered too. She had not asked for this life, yet history remembered her not as a queen of Spain, but as the tragic girl whose first night as consort became the punchline of an entire continent. Her dignity crumbled under the weight of gossip. What should have been a sacred union was reduced to mockery in every court drawing room from Paris to London. The ripple effects were enormous. Instead of projecting stability, Ferdinand projected weakness. Spain's enemies sneered, its allies whispered, and its people shook their heads. Royal power depends on awe, on mystique. But Ferdinand's mystique now came in the form of tavern songs and cruel jokes. And here's the bitter comedy. Dynasties fall for many reasons: war, famine, rebellion. But in Ferdinand's case, the cracks began on his very wedding night, in a scene so disastrous that it still echoes through history. Yet this was not the end. Far from it. Ferdinand would marry again, and again, and again, 4 times in total. Each attempt brought new drama, fresh humiliation, and deeper scars on Spain's reputation. What began as one night of embarrassment would spiral into a pattern of misery that defined his reign. Because when the fate of a kingdom depends on one man's ability to fulfill the simplest expectation of kingship, and he cannot, history doesn't forgive. It laughs. 3. Ferdinand's unlucky wives. If Ferdinand VII's first marriage was a circus, what followed was the entire traveling carnival. He went through 4 wives in total, each marriage its own tragicomedy, each bride dragged unwillingly into a nightmare palace drama. Wife number 1, the shattered teen bride. The first queen, just 16, entered the palace like a lamb dressed for sacrifice. What happened behind those velvet curtains became infamous. Instead of a royal union, there was chaos, tears, and panic. By morning, the servants whispered that the new queen had crumbled under the weight of expectation. She never recovered. Her health collapsed in less than a year. She left no heir, only gossip, and Spain's enemies laughed louder than its bells. Wife number 2, the fading shadow. The second queen walked into the marriage with more caution. Everyone already knew what had happened the first time, and she must have wondered if she would fare better. She did not. Night after night, the same scene played out. Ferdinand storming into the bedchamber like a soldier charging into battle, only for the battle to collapse in awkward silence. The queen tried, she endured, but her face grew pale, her laughter faded, and her health dwindled until even the courtiers whispered that the royal household was cursed. When she died, another black veil fell over Spain. Europe added another verse to its cruel songs about the king who could never deliver. Wife number 3, the Iron Queen. By the time Ferdinand married his third queen, Europe was openly mocking him. France quipped that Spain's true heir was the Undertaker. Britain printed cartoons showing Ferdinand chasing brides through endless palace corridors, never catching them. But this third queen had a streak of steel. She was fiery, determined, and not afraid to challenge Ferdinand's sour moods. For a while, people hoped she would succeed where the others had failed. She stayed longer, endured more, fought harder. But determination couldn't change the royal curse. Night after night, the chamber doors closed, and the same humiliating pattern repeated. Ferdinand blustering like a bull, the queen bracing for disaster, and the courtiers outside trading knowing glances. Her health withered too. Another funeral, another crown placed back in the vault. Spain groaned, Europe howled with laughter. Wife number 4, the miracle and the curse. Finally came wife number 4, Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies. By this point, Ferdinand was older, heavier, and more desperate than ever. He'd buried 3 wives, been mocked by 3 courts, and watched Spain's dynasty dangle over a cliff. But Maria Cristina was clever. She played the part of the dutiful bride, soothed Ferdinand's insecurities, and, against all odds, managed to achieve what the others could not. An heir was born. Bells rang across Spain, priests declared divine intervention, and Ferdinand strutted about the palace like a man who had personally wrestled destiny into submission. For the first time, Spain had hope. But the victory came with a cruel twist. The heir was a daughter, Isabella, and in a kingdom where many believed only a son could rule, the birth sparked fury. Ferdinand tried to change the laws to secure her succession. When he died not long after, the country erupted in civil war, the brutal Carlist Wars, fought over whether his little girl could sit on Spain's throne. A pattern of misery. 4 queens, 3 early graves, 1 daughter born into chaos. That was the sum of Ferdinand's married life. Each bride entered the palace draped in lace and jewels, and each left either broken, buried, or ridiculed. In taverns, Spaniards joked that Ferdinand went through wives faster than wine bottles. In Paris, wits claimed the palace had no nursery, only a morgue. In London, cartoons showed the king surrounded by coffins instead of cradles. And so, Ferdinand's private failures became public legend. His reign was defined not by glory, not by conquest, not even by politics, but by the endless cycle of brides who walked in with hope and walked out in despair. Spain had crowned a king, but Europe remembered a punchline. 4. Court gossip and European mockery. Ferdinand VII's failures were no longer a Spanish secret. By the time his third wife had endured the palace nightmare, the story had leaked, and Europe was merciless. Courts across the continent delighted in the king's humiliation, turning private tragedy into public spectacle. In Paris, satirical artists had a field day. One cartoon depicted Ferdinand lumbering through the palace corridors, a trail of toppled crown jewels marking his path. While brides dashed past him, their dresses in tatters and expressions frozen in horror. Another showed the king attempting to perform his royal duties, only to collapse in confusion while courtiers face-palmed behind gilded screens. The French laughed until their wine glasses rattled, and the phrase, "Spain's fumbling king," entered everyday speech. London was no kinder. The British press published caricatures of Ferdinand as a man perpetually outwitted by his own bedroom, his wives, and even the royal cushions. Pamphlets mocked his misfortunes, calling him the Felon of Madrid, and warning young European princesses to avoid Spanish crowns. Taverns rang with songs about a monarch whose greatest battles were fought indoors and always lost. Even diplomats could barely keep straight faces when negotiating treaties with Spain, fearing they might accidentally snicker during important meetings. Vienna, meanwhile, took a more refined approach, but no less cutting. Nobles exchanged letters filled with veiled references to Spain's cursed bedchamber. One diplomat described Ferdinand as a man whose reputation travels faster than his conquests, a witty way of noting that the king's private failures were shaping Europe's perception of Spanish power. Another whispered that the Spanish throne could only be held upright by humor, not law. Within Spain itself, the gossip was merciless. Court insiders spread exaggerated stories of mismanaged royal evenings, strange routines, and whispered quarrels. Servants reportedly joked about needing maps and compasses to navigate the royal bedchamber. Musicians composed little ditties that mocked the king's attempts at intimacy, while ministers fretted over the country's ability to produce heirs. The effect on Spain's international image was dramatic. A monarch's personal abilities, normally a private matter, had become a political liability. Foreign powers hesitated to trust Spain's stability, and neighboring nations used the gossip as subtle leverage. "How can a king lead armies if he cannot manage a single marriage?" asked one Venetian ambassador in an internal memo. The question, though diplomatic in tone, was clear. Ferdinand's private struggles had national consequences. Yet for all the mockery, there was a darker undercurrent. Ferdinand's wives had suffered. Courts were not only laughing at failure, but also mourning the collateral damage of his cursed reign. Spain's nobles feared that the king's personal incompetence might tip the nation into genuine instability. And in this climate, Ferdinand lumbered on, unaware or indifferent to the growing legend, a monarch who had unwittingly become Europe's favorite satire. The combination of tragedy and comedy made Ferdinand VII a living paradox, simultaneously feared for his power and ridiculed for his private failures. Songs, cartoons, and whispered stories ensured that his reputation would outlive him, circulating far beyond the walls of Madrid. By the time the fourth queen entered his life, Europe had already written the jokes, composed the ditties, and prepared the stage for yet another royal calamity. And yet, despite all the laughter and scorn, Ferdinand's story was still unfolding. There were more brides to marry, more political crises to spark, and more history to shape, all stemming from the peculiar mixture of power, deformity, and luck. Because in the age of monarchies, where appearances and heirs mattered more than deeds, Ferdinand VII had given Europe a spectacle it would never forget. His reign, a mixture of terror, tragedy, and relentless humor, had become a cautionary tale. Even kings are not immune to ridicule. 5. The heir and the Carlist crisis. By the time Ferdinand VII married his fourth wife, the court had all but given up hope. 3 queens had come and gone, leaving the palace haunted by whispers, lampoons, and a trail of mockery that stretched from Madrid to London. Spain had become Europe's theater of private disaster, and Ferdinand was both the star and the punchline. Enter Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies, a queen as clever as she was patient. She quickly learned the unwritten rules of survival. Never challenge the king outright, keep your dignity intact, and above all, do not take anything too seriously. For the first time, the machinery of royal survival seemed to function. Ferdinand's body remained unpredictable, his quirks unmanageable, but somehow, against the odds, an heir was secured. The birth itself became legend, not because of the child, but because of the spectacle surrounding it. Entire courts watched with bated breath, as if expecting some catastrophe to strike at the very last moment. One ambassador later described the scene. Spain had produced an heir, yet the entire court behaved as if the king had wrestled a volcano into submission. The moment was triumphant, yes, but tinged with the absurd. A kingdom hanging on the personal success of a man notorious for failure. But this triumph carried consequences. Ferdinand wanted the child to inherit smoothly, yet the laws of succession were not on his side. Many Spaniards, particularly conservative factions, insisted that only a male heir could reign. This sparked the Carlist Wars, a bloody and protracted conflict that would last decades, fueled entirely by disputes over Ferdinand's personal legacy. It's almost laughable, in a dark, cruel way, that one man's private struggles could spark civil war. Generals marched, cannons roared, and diplomats negotiated, all while Europe shook its head in disbelief. Spain, once a proud and unified kingdom, found itself fractured, its people forced to fight over a family dispute that should have remained behind palace doors. The absurdity didn't end there. Ferdinand, as ever, was oblivious to public opinion. He strutted through Madrid, issuing decrees, rewarding courtiers, and puffing up like a peacock, while the kingdom teetered on the brink. Europe watched and laughed, yet Spain's citizens endured the chaos firsthand. The Carlist armies marched with banners raised high, shouting slogans that indirectly referenced Ferdinand's failures. Even historians of the time could not resist dark jokes, noting that a man whose private incompetence had embarrassed half the continent was now inadvertently orchestrating a war. Meanwhile, inside the palace, the king's personal habits continued to unsettle everyone. He was known to burst into rooms unannounced, mumbling complaints or issuing peculiar commands. Attendants learned to anticipate chaos and keep cushions, curtains, and ceremonial robes ready at all times. The royal household became a place of constant tension, a theater of absurdity where everyone acted, waited, and hoped for the best. And yet, despite all the disorder, Ferdinand had achieved what no one expected. He secured a child who would carry the Bourbon line forward. It was the rare moment where private failure intersected with public triumph. But even this victory was bittersweet. The kingdom was unstable, factions whispered rebellion, and Europe, forever hungry for scandal, continued to mock Spain's miracle heir story. In the end, Ferdinand VII's life exemplifies the terrifying power of personal misfortune in a monarchy. One man's awkwardness, failures, and missteps didn't just humiliate a handful of queens, they reshaped nations, sparked wars, and left Spain a theater for international satire. His reign proved that history is rarely only about battles or diplomacy. Sometimes it's about the grotesque human quirks of a single, very unlucky ruler. Spain's people would remember him as El Rey Felon, the Felon King, a monarch whose private calamities created public chaos, whose quirks became legend, and whose failures would echo through history in ways no army ever could. And while Ferdinand VII may have finally secured an heir, the stories of his reign would continue to entertain, horrify, and bewilder anyone who dared to peek behind the gilded curtains of Spain's royal chambers. 6. The king's public image and court absurdities. Ferdinand VII's reign was a paradox. In public, he was a king draped in velvet and authority. In private, he was a monarch whose very presence inspired whispered panic. To the people of Spain, he appeared regal, commanding, and imperious. To those who knew him closely, he was less than majestic. Court observers noted his peculiar routines. He would rise at unpredictable hours, summon ministers without warning, and conduct audiences in ways that left advisors bewildered. One diplomat wrote that Ferdinand moved through the palace like a man walking on a tightrope over a pit of invisible crocodiles, meaning that even the simplest of interactions could quickly turn chaotic. Courtiers learned quickly: never assume order, never trust tradition, and always keep one eye on the king. His appearance didn't help. He carried himself like royalty, yes, but the weight of awkward gestures, puffs of nervous energy, and an expression that seemed perpetually caught between confusion and indignation made him an easy target for satire. Palace artists and foreign caricaturists had a field day. One French pamphlet depicted Ferdinand as a man carrying the entire Spanish crown on his back, struggling to balance it while tripping over his own robes. The caption read, "A kingdom too heavy for one man." London was equally cruel. Cartoons showed him attempting to command armies while his own council snickered in the background. Even daily court rituals turned into comedy. Royal feasts were meticulously planned, yet Ferdinand often demanded last-minute changes. He would rearrange seating charts, issue bizarre proclamations about dessert orders, or insist that musicians play marches in reverse. Courtiers learned to nod and smile, though behind their polite faces they whispered, "The Felon King reigns, but sanity departs." But the public was not spared either. Street songs and tavern ditties celebrated, or rather mocked, Ferdinand's eccentricities. One popular tune warned young men to avoid the Spanish crown, not for battle, but for surviving the king's unpredictable temper. Another claimed that Spain's true monarch was a cup of wine, strong enough to endure the king's whims. Even ambassadors had to tread carefully, knowing that a misstep in conversation could lead to scandal, or at least endless laughter in foreign courts. Ferdinand's failures in private life amplified the absurdity of his public image. Every mismanaged marriage, every whispered embarrassment, and every disastrous wedding night fueled satire, cartoons, and gossip. It was as if Spain's monarchy had been turned into a stage play, with Ferdinand as both the tragic hero and the comedic fool. Ministers and courtiers performed their parts, trying desperately to maintain dignity while the king unwittingly orchestrated chaos. The grotesque humor extended even to ceremonial matters. During official events, Ferdinand's awkward gestures and unpredictable instructions made every procession feel like a slapstick performance. Nobles learned to anticipate improvisation, a sudden halt here, a bizarre announcement there, and perhaps a misplaced throne cushion for added effect. Guests would later recall these ceremonies as unforgettable spectacles, the kind of stories that grew taller with each retelling. Yet despite the mockery, Ferdinand VII remained Spain's king. He signed treaties, collected taxes, and made decrees. His reign was real, and the consequences of his eccentricities were tangible. The Carlist Wars raged, Europe laughed, and the royal household trembled. And yet, he persisted, a monarch who combined personal misfortune with national consequence, all while unknowingly providing the continent with endless entertainment. In the end, Ferdinand VII's public image became inseparable from his private failures. He was a king admired by no one, feared by some, and endlessly mocked by all. His eccentricities, his misfortunes, and his grotesque mismanagement of the royal household ensured that history would remember him not just as a ruler, but as the man whose every move was a scandal waiting to happen. Spain's monarchy had survived, barely, but Europe would never forget the Felon King, a monarch who turned misfortune into legend and private calamity into public comedy. 7. The final years and lasting legacy. As Ferdinand VII aged, his reign became a curious mix of spectacle, tragedy, and farce. The man who had terrified and embarrassed queens, baffled ministers, and amused entire continents now confronted the final act of his life, a period defined by fragility, paranoia, and relentless gossip. His health, always precarious, deteriorated. Courtiers tiptoed around him, anticipating unpredictable outbursts, odd demands, or sudden proclamations. Some claimed that just walking past him in the hallway required strategic choreography, lest they be dragged into bizarre royal rituals or caught in a whirlwind of temper. One contemporary observer quipped that surviving a day in the palace was more challenging than surviving a battlefield. Even in public, Ferdinand's eccentricities were impossible to hide. He attended ceremonies with an air of pomp, yet small gestures, a misfired bow, a misplaced scepter, or a sudden pause mid-speech, transformed events into unintentional comedy. Diplomats, visiting dignitaries, and even foreign royalty found themselves both terrified and entertained. France printed new cartoons, Britain's newspapers added fresh caricatures, and Spain's populace whispered endlessly about their king's peculiarities. Ferdinand's private failures had long spilled into public life, creating a reputation that would outlive him. But the absurdity of his personal misfortunes continued to have real consequences. Spain teetered on the edge of political chaos. The Carlist Wars raged, fueled by disputes over the succession of his daughter, Isabella. Nobles fought fiercely over inheritance claims, while common citizens endured the fallout of civil unrest. All of this, in some tragicomic sense, could be traced back to Ferdinand's inability to navigate private life with grace. What began as awkward marriages and scandalous rumors had evolved into national turmoil. Despite this, Ferdinand's reign did have its moments of apparent triumph. He secured Isabella's succession, finally produced a Bourbon heir, and maintained the appearance of royal authority. Yet every success was shadowed by grotesque irony. A kingdom stabilized by a monarch whose personal life had been a continuous series of public failures and humiliations. The contrast between image and reality fascinated Europe. Writers, diplomats, and storytellers chronicled Spain's monarchy with equal parts awe and ridicule. Even in death, Ferdinand's legacy was complicated. He passed away in 1833, leaving behind a kingdom both secure and fractured. Isabella ascended the throne as a young queen, but the Carlist factions continued to challenge her, resulting in decades of civil strife. Historians later noted that Ferdinand's personal misfortunes had directly shaped European politics, turning a single family's private chaos into a prolonged national drama. Yet beyond politics, his reign remained a source of scandalous fascination. The grotesque humor of his life, awkward gestures, failed marriages, and relentless court gossip ensured that he would be remembered more for calamity than conquest. In Spain, taverns sang songs, playwrights wrote sketches, and caricaturists immortalized him as the king who could embarrass a continent without trying. In Paris, London, and Vienna, diplomats and observers continued to mock him in letters and newspapers, ensuring that Ferdinand's legend outlived his life. The final years of Ferdinand VII thus solidified his place in history as a monarch who was both tragic and absurd. He had shaped Spain's future in profound ways, yet had done so while providing endless material for satire. Personal failure, public mockery, and political consequence intertwined, leaving a legacy unlike any other European king. Spain endured, Isabella reigned, and the Bourbon line continued. But history remembered the Felon King not just as a ruler, but as a man whose private calamities became Europe's theater, whose quirks sparked wars, and whose grotesque misfortunes would echo for centuries. In the end, Ferdinand VII's life proves one immutable truth. In monarchy, private failure is never private, and even the smallest misfortune can reshape nations. And so, the story of Spain's most notorious king comes to a close, a tale of scandal, chaos, and dark humor that Europe would never forget. And there you have it, the astonishing, bizarre, and unforgettable reign of Ferdinand VII, Spain's Felon King. A monarch whose private misfortunes turned into public spectacle, whose personal failures sparked civil wars, and whose grotesque quirks became legend across Europe. From disastrous marriages to court chaos, from relentless gossip to the dramatic Carlist Wars, Ferdinand VII proved that even kings are not immune to humiliation. History remembers him not just as a ruler, but as a cautionary tale. The fate of a kingdom can hinge on the most human of flaws. If you enjoyed uncovering the dark secrets, absurd scandals, and twisted tales of Ferdinand VII, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more shocking and controversial stories from history. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode where the past is stranger and darker than fiction. And don't forget to like and comment. Which European monarch scandal shocked you the most? We want to hear your thoughts, and we'll dive even deeper in future videos. Because history isn't just about battles and kings, it's about the human drama that made those battles unforgettable. And remember, the past is full of stories that are as shocking as they are true. Stay tuned for more dark secrets of history, and let the chaos of kings past remind you that even rulers can be hilariously, tragically, and grotesquely human.